Welcome to the Modern Artrepreneur, a podcast documenting my circuitous approach to blending art and entrepreneurship. As long as I can remember, I've been telling stories, and most of them have been true. But whether it's elaborate tales of far-off mythical lands or right here at home conspiracy theories, I enjoy weaving a tale to capture the attention of everyone listening. Storytelling would become a lifelong passion of mine, cultivated from a spiritual youth, repeatedly tested in high school, stretched to its limits in young adulthood, and hopefully one day soon, I'll financially profit from it as well. The year's 1991. Both of my brothers had moved out, so the farthest room, the end of the hall that used to be lived in by my brother Brian, was turned into the computer room. I remember my dad spending nights down there writing legal briefs and hiding from my mother. Just kidding, Mom, I know you're listening. But the time frame of this computer is important because it puts everything into perspective. My parents were madly in love and occasionally wanted to go out without me, so our go-to babysitter was a teenager up the hill by the name of Tiari. It just so happened that Tiari was also enrolled in one of the first waves of computer typing classes offered in local high schools. So her homework was to type, or at least that's how my memories framed it. I have vivid memories of Tiari sitting at that computer, typing in a Word document as I walked around the room, narrating a story for her to type down. We must have spent hours back there just spinning tale after tale about dinosaurs and Mars and girls I had crushes on and whatever craziness I could come up with at that age. I've mentioned this particular story before on my blog, but before I continue, I would like to apologize to Mrs. Smart, my 4th grade teacher. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the importance of book club in the learning and development process of reading. It is not enough to just read the book. You must internalize it and use that knowledge to help you reach conclusions about your everyday life. 20 years ago, when I was in your class, Mrs. Smart, I did not respect your book club and all the good it was doing for me. Had I done so, I surely wouldn't be recording this podcast now. My 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Smart, is a very intelligent woman, no pun intended, and she'd read a ton of books, and this is back before the internet. Our school's library held around 50,000 volumes, so I thought to myself, when choosing a book to read, surely there are some in here that Mrs. Smart's never read before. What about this one? Should I read this? I'd ask her. Catcher in the Rye. That's a good book, but it's a little mature for you. You should try to find another one. So I combed the shelves for a book I thought she'd never, ever read before. And what may come is no surprise to anyone, I found most of my successes in the sci-fi and fantasy genres of the library. If there was a picture of a guy in a spacesuit fighting some other creature on a planet other than Earth, there was a fairly good chance it hadn't made it onto Mrs. Smart's reading list yet. How about this one, The Last Duel on Mars? Never heard of it, she'd say. Great, thanks, Mrs. Smart. Again, let me remind you, this is before the internet. There was no Amazon, there was no Wikipedia, and there was sure as hell no SparkNotes for The Last Duel on Mars. I'm sure you can all see where this is going, so every Wednesday at book club, we were required to write a 2-page synopsis of what we read over the last week and be prepared to share it with our classmates. There was always the implication that you would be questioned, most likely by the teacher. So that meant every Tuesday night, I was at home just making shit up. And I've got to admit, I did really have it down to a science by the end there. The book's cover art was nearly always my primary guide. There's always a central figure, a supporting character, and most likely someone of the opposite gender opposing each other on the cover. Maybe they look like each other, but they're too afraid to talk about it. See, look, I'm already starting to tell a story that is in all likelihood 0.00009% the same as the actual book. And that tiny percentage does not match a handful of the character names, which I was able to find from the other books, read short excerpts, I would find proper nouns. Writing 500 words on a book that didn't actually exist is more difficult than it sounds, especially when it came to a book club. The book reports I wrote were based on stories that obviously didn't actually exist, but the facts were not tangible, so they weren't negotiable or debatable at all. If I said the main character was a man struggling with loss, nobody could argue with me, nobody'd read this book. But I had to be ready to explain what I thought the protagonist really wanted in life, what the man was learning from struggling with his loss, which is when I would start saying things like, oh, yeah, I forgot, his mother died and left everything to his sister. In order not to get caught, I had to create a pretty solid, not real version of this book in my head, and each week report a little progress towards the book's exciting conclusion. I needed to be telling a story about the book that would keep the book club entranced by my words. Somehow, I pulled it off. So, like I said, sorry, Mrs. Smart. In high school and college, I found my storytelling being tested in an entirely different way, through art critiques. For those of you who don't know or have never taken an art class before, or a studio class, shame on you! Come on! Take a class, learn to draw, calm your mind, and let your creativity go in whatever form it comes out. It'll be one of the best things that ever happened to you, I swear. Anyway, so art critiques are when everybody in an art class, they all pin up their projects on the walls and they present it to the entire class, giving an artist statement for the rest of the class to critique and ask questions or not ask questions. I know you may be struggling to understand how art class has anything to do with writing an ebook, but bear with me, we're getting there. So, like I said, an art critique is an opportunity for an artist to display their work and hopefully grow through constructive criticism and discussion with the rest of their classmates. We would be given an assignment, and then this piece of art, this thing that I'm about to present that's pinned up on the wall, is what I came up with in response. It's this assignment-directed art that allowed me to continue crafting my storytelling, both visually and orally. So in art, specifically critiques, the project is real, right? It's tangible. It's on the wall and we're all looking at it. So we can ask questions about specific things that we see. We're going to look at it and think about how it applies to the concept or the assignment we were all given. You know, you're going to explain that this is what you came up with. So when it was my turn to defend my art, it was my turn to tell a story. For my final drawing project, I constructed a somewhat controversial piece involving cutouts from Playboy magazine, covered in abstract uli line art, along with a mirrored sticker. I'd come into class frequently while working on it to discover other teachers had covered it with paper so that classes wouldn't be distracted by it. I find that argument entertaining considering there were frequently real naked people standing in the middle of these figure drawing classes, but nevertheless. I presented my piece to the class, titled Objective Validation, a comment on the nude modeling world and one's ambition to be coveted, receiving validation by being objectified, and the difference between doing it in an artistic yet sexual way. The mirror sticker was cut in the shape of a model, so the viewer could, see yourself up there. It was admittedly something else. After the final critique, I was approached by a female classmate. "Your piece was certainly interesting," she said, and her tone was not very complimentary. "Thanks. I thought it would be a little controversial," I responded. She smiled and nodded and stood there for a moment. "You're an artist, Chris. A bullshit artist." And then she walked away. After graduation, I moved to Sydney, Australia for a bit. I wanted to go into advertising, but nobody would give me a job because I was technically there under a working holiday visa. So they thought that if they were to give me any responsibility I couldn't handle, I would just bounce back to the United States. Obviously, they just didn't know me. But I kept a journal while I was traveling, and it was there in Sydney that I decided I wanted to go to law school. So I returned from Australia in December 2008 and immediately started studying for the LSAT. In my off time, I would turn back to my travel journal and I would romanticize about what was happening in those words. I wanted to see it come to life in a book. So I turned my travel journal into a Romana Clef novel about a young coffee fortune heir that is forced to relocate to Australia under false pretenses, then ends up getting himself into actual trouble and is forced to go on the run with no way to get back to the States. I wrote a good 270 pages of that novel before I started law school, but sadly, I've never returned to it. Until now. More on that later. And although I never finished law school, I will happily declare that attending law school gave me the tools and a mindset that changed my life for the better, particularly in my research and writing skills. Other than my father, I was initially drawn to law because of the grandeur and storytelling at trial. At the time, I felt, and sometimes still do feel, that I would have been a phenomenal criminal trial attorney because I love telling stories. And that was the class I excelled in best. But ultimately, after deferring from law school to get into a better law school, I spent a year as a civil litigation paralegal. And I decided that I wanted to tell stories that affected more than a dozen people at a time. Besides, no one calls their lawyer when they're having a good day. So in 2012, I quit law to become a writer. I wrote my first screenplay when I was 14 years old, and it was called Requiem for a Dream, which was, thank God, nothing like the movie Requiem for a Dream. Oh my God, that would have been crazy. But instead it was about how I had a crush on this girl and she didn't really like me. I sat down with a parent of a friend who happens to be a television screenwriter, and he gave me the stepping stones for the beginning of writing a screenplay. Proper formatting, proper attention, kind of how to introduce the scenes, slug lines, the whole thing. So I toyed with it, and while I was in college, I wrote, in the period of one night, a script called The Brotherhood, which is about a guy who's part of a pledge class joining a fraternity, and he did feel all of the crazy events that happened during fraternity pledging, and at one time thought he was going to die. That one also may or may not have been based on real life, but it was really my second exploit into screenwriting, and that one was a good opportunity to inspire me to write another script. So I wrote a script called Pursuit, but it was originally called The Omega Unit. And that was about a high-speed pursuit unit that is the SWAT team of car chases. So they would be called in whenever there was a high-speed chase that needed to end quickly and safely, and a dramatic story entailing a new recruit and a potential cover-up and murder all play into this story. And I wrote this screenplay at night and in the mornings while I was working as a paralegal. So I would rush home from work and I would write for hours into the night, and then I'd wake up at 6:30 and I would write until I had to leave for work. And I worked really hard and I submitted it to a screenplay competition, the Westfield screenwriting competition, and I won an award that was in a small category, but I won an award. And from that moment, there was a small sign, a small bit of validation that made me think that maybe I'm good at this. So at that point, I put my nose to the grindstone and I wrote as much as I could. And at that point, I received an offer to write a script based on the true story of a couple, the amazing true story of an old couple in back east, and their amazing story from Vienna in World War II, escaping to Shanghai. It's beautiful, and I would love to tell you more about it if we didn't have teeth in this thing moving it forward. But when I got finally paid to write and research and do this, I knew that I had a tone and a style and a sense of my own writing that I could stand confidently behind it. So I continued to write, and I really pursued a career in screenwriting. And I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote. I wrote The Dream Job. I wrote a script called Unit C19 about storage units. I wrote a story called The Chessboard Killer, which is based on Alexander Pichushkin, a real-life Russian serial killer. I wrote a spec pilot about fracking. I wrote another true-life story, The Valentich Disappearance, about an airplane disappearance in Australia in 1978. And I was just recently, I entered a competition and won the opportunity to write the Love and Krylon script. So I have a number of stories, 1,200 pages worth of writing, stories, storytelling that I would love to get out into the world, that I would love to share with people. But they're never going to read these scripts, which means that these versions of these stories may never get told. So when I'm out there telling my friends that I'm doing all sorts of writing and that I'm writing screenplays, they'll never see them. They will never read them unless something good happens with them. But more often than not, they will just disappear, right? No screenplay is ever finished. It is only abandoned. So, one by one, I had to abandon these screenplays to move on to start the next one. I decided to take some time back, take some time away from screenwriting, and focus on my other writing. At which point I decided maybe I could turn these screenplays into a collection of short stories. On the next episode of The Modern Artrepreneur.
I gave the game to this family that I work with, this lady that I work with, and she was going to do some playtests this weekend. I gave her the instructions printed out from online, just the ones that were in the Bible.
Cool, good.
But she was honest to me, and this other guy was super honest to me. They were like, listen, man, you're gonna lay out this game for these kids and they're gonna make up their own fucking rules. They're gonna figure out, these kids are adventurous, they're questioning. They have just gone through preschool, or kindergarten, so they're understanding like numbers and letters now. They're like trying to, elaborate on things more rather than it's not just touchy-feely anymore. It's like actually using their brain. So she was like, yeah, my kids are dumb. They're dumb, but they're beautiful. So they're just gonna make up their own game to this game. But I'm gonna lay out the groundwork as much as I can. I was like, perfect. That's exactly what we need.